I know.
We're just mean people, basically.
We'll just schedule a follow-up.
Yeah.
Right? Like Jamie's like, did you really have to do that? Did you really have to cut us off? All right. Well, we'd love to hear, before I get to do my introduction that I'm so excited about, we'd love to hear just from a few of you of why you chose to attend today.
Feel free to take yourself off mute or put it in the chat.
I would love to share why I attended today, because when I came, I've been wanting to join you for a long time. My name is Becky Joseph, and among other things, I'm on the Jewish Studio Project board. I'm also on the board of Development Executives Roundtable here in the Bay Area. And when I came last time, several wonderful things happened. One was that I had a fabulous conversation with Jamie Allen Black, and we got paired again together this morning. Thank you, facilitators. And
Fate.
what's that?
I said
Fate. Yes.
Zoom fate, which is a specific kind of fate.
As my beloved grandmother would have said, thank you, God.
Yes.
So that was a wonderful thing. And it was also, I've done some work with Paula Pretlow and some of the foundations that she's involved with. So it's always a pleasure. And it was a magnificent and magnificently facilitated conversation, I thought. And then finally, Gamal, if you don't mind my telling this story, you did such a beautiful thing for me. I have a disability, and there are times, I have several disabilities, but there are times when it is more pronounced than others. And when I put my question last week into the chat and I looked at it after I pressed send, I was horrified because it was almost unreadable, because I have difficulty sometimes getting complete sentences from my head to my hands, and without an editor, it comes out like that. And Gamal, you were so, what you did for me was so kind, because not only did you read the question and make sense of it, but when I sent you a private message to thank you, you sent me back the kindest and loveliest and really most loving response. And so for all of those reasons and more, that's why I'm here this morning.
All the feels. Thank you. Our pleasure. Thank you for that. Anybody want to go after that? Anybody want to share?
Thank you.
Maybe we can just put into the chat, what it is, what you hope to get out of today, or why you're here. And I'll move into introducing Yolanda so we can hopefully have another inspiring, helpful conversation. So there are many accolades that I could list of Yolanda's, but I believe that you have her bio, and if not, we'll send it to you. So I'm not going to do the whole bio situation. I've had the absolute honor and privilege of getting to know Yolanda through Schusterman Foundation. So we were both Schusterman Fellows together, and which is a 18-month life, hopefully altering journey. And Yolanda, from the very beginning, we didn't even really talk for the first, day or two of the time that we were together, but she carries herself with such grace and dignity. And, every question, every thought that comes out of this person's body is so layered and full of real complexity and passion and compassion. And so I've been able to be a friend to Yolanda, a colleague. We've been advisors to one another. And she's now has a senior fantastic role at URJ, continuing her work as a social justice, racial justice, equity advocate, and leader. And I'm just we are really thrilled to have you here today and that you were able to make time for this conversation. So thank you so much, Yolanda, for being here.
Wow. Thank you, Gamal. I looked at the corner of the screen to make sure that was recorded. That is one of the most beautiful introductions I've ever had. And I was listening to Rebecca talk about why she was here. And then if you just listen to the way Gamal introduced me, I thought about the Maya Angelou quote that says, you know, you may not necessarily remember what people say. You may forget what they did, but you will always remember how they made you feel. And I can attest to that. And Gamal is that kind of person and that kind of leader. Thank you so much for having me. Seth, it's been a pleasure getting to know you. I am really, really excited about spending this time with you and being in this space together. I would just like to say that I use she, her pronouns. And I'm in Washington, D.C. on Pamunkey, Piscataway, and Anacostan tribal land. And really briefly, I want to tell you why we use pronouns to introduce ourselves, and then why I also do land acknowledgements. I use pronouns to make sure that everyone who comes to a space feels like they belong in that space. And if they have an opportunity to share their pronouns, it makes it easier when everyone is sharing their pronouns. And so that is one of the major reasons I do that. And then the second piece is acknowledging the indigenous communities who lived here long before any of us were here, and just honoring the land that I am currently inhabiting. And so those are the reasons for those two things.
Thank you so much. I think it's important for us to remind ourselves why we are doing things that we've been asked to do, even, you know, and that we might not have thought to do ourselves, pronouns being one of them, you know, and to really stay connected to these more nuanced pieces of the movement, right, of the equity, diversity, and inclusion movement. So Yolanda, we'd love to just start off with a little bit of a story. To hear from you, you know, why equity in board governance is important to you, and what does equity in board governance look like to you? So if you have a little anecdote or a story, and if not, if you just want to talk about it sort of extemporaneously, but just, you know, again, is, you know, why equity in board governance is important to you, and what does equity in board governance look like to you?
Great question. So I've been thinking a little bit about board governance because I have recently joined 2 boards. And additionally, I've also been an executive director. So I've been on that side of the coin working with boards. And I think it's really important that boards always think about equity as a part of who they are. And it's not something that's kind of separate and siloed. But if you're a board, equity is a part of it. It's a part of what you do, just like finance is, and looking at the governing pieces and looking at the programmatic activities. Equity is also a part of that. So one of the things I've been thinking about as I accepted the board responsibilities as a member of a board is, what role do I play on this board? And understanding that there's a me as an individual, and then there's the collective body, the board. And one of the most important parts, I think, for individuals to think about as board members is thinking about the internal work that we always have to do. That there is a very important part of being able to contribute to a larger entity that has to do with the work that we're doing as individuals. And so, kind of wearing my executive director hat a little bit, one of the things that I really tried to get across to my board of directors is that there's not this grandfathering in process that happens when you're on a board. It means that you are a great person. It means that you love the mission of the organization. It means a lot of things, but it doesn't automatically equal, that you've done the transformative individual, kind of what I call mirrors work of the introspection piece that has to be done. And if I could say one thing, I think that's a huge part of this. And it actually impacts helping the organization reach its mission. Sometimes people say, I'm part of this collective body and we're a board as a body, but individuals make up this board. And if individuals are on their own journey, learning about the impacts of systemic racism, learning about internal implicit biases that we all carry with us, understanding how we're operating in this larger system of white supremacy and white culture, is a really important key component of being the board member that we need to be, and really focusing every single thing we do through an equity lens. And that's hard. It's harder to do that internal work where we have to turn that mirror around and say, what are the things I need to work on as an individual, as opposed to doing that more external collective work around equity. But I do challenge us to think about that and know that we're on a journey, that, we're going to sometimes take detours and we're not going to always go forward, but thinking about our individual roles and responsibilities through this kind of tikkun midot model of diving in and doing the work that we have to do in order to be stronger for that collective board governance that we're being called to be a part of.
Yeah. Yes. And, just to build off of that and to bring some local events, if you will. So first, I just also want to acknowledge that we're nearing the end of Pride Month. So just to acknowledge anyone who is celebrating Pride Month or is, an ally, or just, now is reminded that it's Pride Month. So you're feeling good about Pride, but I wanted to just put that into the space. And during Pride Month this year, a different sort of moment happened for the Black community in particular, but really for the country, which is that, and you spoke about white supremacy culture, and which is that Juneteenth became a federated holiday. And so there's a lot of discourse around this decision and this moment. I certainly have my own opinions, but I'd love to hear from you, Yolanda. What does that mean to the equity and inclusion efforts for nonprofit boards? So Juneteenth being a national holiday, what does that mean for equity and inclusion efforts of nonprofit boards?
Yes, lots happening. And I really love that question because I've been thinking a lot about Juneteenth. Last year, I was invited to give a speech, a talk around Juneteenth, and I honestly had mixed emotions around it because last year, of course, Juneteenth wasn't a national holiday, and this year it is. And I've started thinking about what does that actually mean. And while I am extremely excited, I am happy that Juneteenth is a holiday. I don't want us to get complacent and say, well, we've done the work. Juneteenth is a holiday, and we move on to something else. I think we have to sometimes rewind the clock back and think about why Juneteenth exists in the first place. Juneteenth exists because for 2 years, there are enslaved Africans who are descendants of enslaved Africans at that point, who carried on as slaves for 2 years after the rest of the country had been emancipated. And if you think about the cruelty in that, it makes you really think about the complexities of the holiday. And so I think when we think about equity and inclusion, that it's one thing to have a seat at the table, but if you haven't created the ecosystem in order to really support diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that goes for our organizations, that goes for our boards, that goes for the communities that we're involved in, then we're just putting a rubber stamp on it. And not to say that Juneteenth is that, but I don't want it to be that. I want to make sure that there are continued efforts to do the things that we need to do. I'm going to throw reparations out there. I can't say, pushing for that, but continuing to have those conversations. What does truth and reconciliation look like in this country? Juneteenth is a good start. Bringing people to our communities, around our board tables, to our organizations is a good start, but we got to cultivate that ecosystem as well. And so that's on all of us to do. It's not just one person's responsibility, but that's a collective energy that has to be put forward. Sorry about my email there, to make sure that happens.
Yeah. I also agree with you. And, I urge all of us to be able to hold both celebration and accomplishment. I mean, there are people who fought long and hard and have been fighting for years for Juneteenth to be a federated holiday. And as you said, we cannot get complacent, right? So sometimes I think in movement making, we forget the people that moved things for us to be making what we're making today. And so that certainly seems to be happening. And I'm glad that, to hear you help us think about it in terms of boards. It's really useful. So just a few more questions, one or two before we hand it over to Seth, who also has some questions for you. You've worked in small organizations and large organizations. What is unique about each kind of those boards in relation to their equity practices or processes?
This may be a little bit more controversial, and I'm using an example of working in a very small organization that had limited resources, that had a very busy board. And when I say that, a busy board that was involved with a lot of, honestly, the programmatic pieces, the day-to-day pieces. They were hands-on a lot because of the size of the organization. And because of that, and because of the small nature of the organization, oftentimes the real governing work didn't happen because no one was really being held accountable for that piece. And so I've thought a lot about this, because while a lot of day-to-day things happened because we were so understaffed and we needed hands, we needed that sweat equity piece. A lot of kind of the longer term planning, tools of accountability, focus on really what boards needed to do around their own equity work went missing. And I think in part it's because of the nature of smaller organizations where there just isn't usually enough resources to support what's happening. So that's not all small organizations or small boards. That's the one that I, speaking from an I statement, have experienced and saw as one of the major challenges of getting the board to hold themselves accountable for equity. Because ironically enough, the organization was focused on building those bridges and focusing on equity and fighting racism and anti-Semitism. So there was this kind of, grandfathering, I think, that happened as well, that if I'm a part of this, if I'm on this board, then I'm automatically doing that piece. And as I mentioned before, there's no automatic granting of, doing that internal deep dive work that you have to do as an individual, regardless of what your organization is. You still have to do that work. So that's my experience from kind of the smaller organization perspective. So from a larger organization perspective, I work for the Union for Reform Judaism, and we have a very big board. And so one of the things—
How big is that board?
Well, it can actually get up to 250 people. Right now, I think we're in the 140, so we're not quite as big as we could be, but just think adding another 100 people to a board that's already pretty big is like a small town. So, and so it's interesting because you don't have those challenges of needing people and hands-on, and kind of more like the equity piece. This board is probably more focused on kind of the fiscal pieces and the bureaucracy of managing a board that size is really, really challenging. And getting people to also say, equity is my role, because you can have a committee of 25 people who are really focused on a specific thing, and the equity piece is a separate piece. So I think when you have larger organizations and larger boards, it's harder to really make sure equity is embedded in everything that people are doing, because they're focused mainly on the governing and the fiscal responsibilities of boards. Unless there's a program committee, there's maybe a DEI committee, and those are the folks that are doing that. Our role is to do this. And the challenge is making sure that it's integrated in everything. And when you have a larger body of people, it's just more challenging to make sure that that's part of their goals and objectives for why they're on the board.
Yeah, thank you. So I have one more question and then we're passing it to Seth. Okay, so my question is that over the past year and a half now, many organizations have gone through at minimum workshops, if not, education around racial justice, equity, inclusion, anti-racism. What about what has changed, right, in this sort of changed world that we're in? What's becoming easier about the work because like we, meaning those who are participating, so we are more educated and more more aware. So what's becoming easier about that, and what do people on this call need to know about what's making the work harder, because folks are now more engaged in the education pieces?
Yeah, wow, quite a question. I like that, because I think that is where we are there. There are more people involved with, and interested in racial equity and justice work than, say, a year ago, when we had the killing of George Floyd and so many other people. There was this racial reckoning, I think, due to the pandemic and people weren't involved with their own lives, that has really raised the bar, in a sense, of the number of people who have engaged in this topic, in this issue. And so with that, I think it's easier to bring people to the table to have these conversations. There are a lot more people interested, involved, participating in those conversations. And that's great. I think one of the challenges and what makes it harder is that we have to get people to think past the kind of one-time, one-off, where it's like, well, I've done this amount of work, and now I'm anti-racist, to use that term. That this is a lifelong journey, that we are doing this with no end in sight. We are doing this not for us. We're, back in the 60s and the early civil rights period, all of the people who lost their lives, who lost livelihood, who gave so much time and energy for the cause, they didn't necessarily reap those benefits. We're reaping those benefits now. And so the thing that we have to think about is, what are we doing? What are we putting in place? What seeds are we planting now? Not for us, but for our descendants, for people who are going to come after us. And I think that that's one of the challenges of this work, that I'm okay with people just finally saying that systemic racism exists last year, which systemic racism is embedded into the culture and fabric of every single thing we do in this country. That's okay if some people are just coming to that realization. But I also want them to understand that this is a life's work, and it's not something that you can just turn on and turn off. For the people who are living this life, we don't get to turn it on and turn it off.
I'm just letting that sit there.
I'll say amen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Yolanda. So I'm gonna yield my time because I don't have any left, but I'm to Seth to ask a few more questions, and also we can engage. I mean, anyone here, I know Seth put it into the chat, but if you also have questions, please put them into the chat so we can ask them.
Thanks, Gamal. Thanks, Yolanda. I actually just have one. I have lots. I'm going to share one question, and then there's already a couple questions in the chat that we'll get to. I'm curious. I'm always curious to hear like the tachlis, like the specifics, right? So your work at the URJ, your work in health equity, your work on these boards now. I'm curious to know, and I think we all are, and maybe one more framing. I think there's people on this call who have been at this for years, if not decades, and there are people on this call who might be just starting, right? Just starting an executive position or joining a board for the first time. Can you highlight a couple practices or processes? You already mentioned, and just to highlight kind of that turning inward and that kind of looking into oneself as an education tool and practice. I'm curious, can you build on that? What other, again, practices or processes would be really helpful for to hear from you if they are kind of at any place, given that people are at different places on their journey. Oops. There we go. Okay, go for it.
Okay, Seth, could you maybe the last 10 seconds, could you repeat?
What are some specific practices, policies, habits that boards can begin like at their next board meeting to start really thinking about equity and inclusion work and how to make that a meaningful part of their board governance, of their board culture?
I love that question, because I think there are kind of short-term, intermediate, and long-term things that you can think about doing around equity for boards. And the first thing is what I did earlier. Give people some guidelines and information about introducing themselves with their pronouns. I have an app on my phone called Native Lands, and you just click on that and it will tell you where where you live and what tribe is there. Even starting with something like that and integrating it into thank you, Seth, into what you do every time you have a board meeting speaks volumes, because people will just start thinking on their own about the pieces that I think are important for us to connect with greater humanity, to make that connection. And so while we're on our boards and we're there to support the mission of the organization, we're also thinking about what happens outside our board and what's happening in the community and happening in our world. And it's just a really small way, I think, to do that. I think a longer term goal is to do an assessment, actually do like an assessment of your board governance structure and who's there, and really thinking about who you can bring on your board that would really enhance the conversation, not just grabbing someone and saying, hey, we're looking for diversity, but really thinking about skill sets, thinking about people in your orbit that you could bring on the board who would really enhance the conversations and help you think outside of the box about how to do board business, how to really connect more deeply with your mission through an equity lens. And then I think a longer term goal for boards is to really think about building this pipeline of leaders. And so we always kind of, I know that I really focus on how do I bring younger leaders into the fold, making sure that they have opportunities to lead, because soon the younger generation will take over, and always kind of thinking with this pipeline of leaders in mind and thinking about that through a lens of diversity and equity, I think would be really helpful too. And there are lots of other things that you can do along the way, looking at creating a DEI, or there are a lot of acronyms out there, DEIB, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Belonging Committee, a READY committee, racial equity. There's another acronym out there, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, but maybe creating a small committee that's looking at integrating equity and inclusion practices throughout the entire board structure.
Wonderful. Thanks, Yolanda. One of the things you just mentioned reminded me of one of the boards I'm on, also Jewish Studio Project. We're going through a racial equity audit. So we're working with a consultant who is asking some just really helpful generative questions. And I'll just say, surprisingly, it's not questions like how many people of color on your board and you know, how many people of color do you want on your, it's not those, it's more just, again, questions around practices, processes, and habits, around evaluations, around accountability, around pipeline, like you said. So just to underscore, yeah, those ideas, those examples are great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to.
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing about that, is that that's part of the beauty of people having engaged in this work at this point, is that hopefully we can start getting past this kind of more, kind of transactional, like there's a role for some of that, but now it's time to dive deeper and really think about the things that are going to sustain equity and really make people come into environments where they actually feel like they belong and they stay there. They don't say this is not ready, for real diversity and leave, but we're really trying to create the environment where they stay and everybody's a part of the conversation in an equitable way. Beautiful.
Amen. I want to lift up one of the questions in the chat, Roxanne, do you want to just verbalize this or share it with Yolanda and the group?
Sure, I'm happy to. And actually, Valerie sent me a chat back with a really lovely potential solution or one way to approach this. So, the question, to paraphrase, is where there are, and Yolanda, you talked a bit about the responsibilities of board for financial sustainability of organizations. And as such, there's often talk about money and financial contributions and different expectations, whether or not there's a minimum level. And, so how should we be considering this with an equity lens? And, I think there could be one simple answer that says, oh, don't include a giving minimum, but there are realities of organizations. And I'll just share what Valerie chatted to me is that there are ways to encourage generosity at whatever level. So to ask people to include this organization as one of their top 3 that they support, no matter what the level, so that there could be some, at least contribution and participation. But I'm wondering what else, what other suggestions you have to approach the ideas of money and giving with an equitable lens.
Yeah, it's always a question, and it definitely should be. When you're wearing your board hat, you're also responsible for the fiscal health of the organization. And so there have been multiple approaches to this. I think maybe the first thing to think about is having several positions on your board that are flexible, where there's some flexibility in giving. Not that everyone who has a diverse background is unable to actually meet the board minimums. We want to be careful about that, because that's not necessarily the case. But for anyone who comes in who will maybe instead give services or give resources in kind, thinking about the areas that the organization could use assistance in, and then that board member is able to maybe be a consultant to IT or, participate in that way to make sure that they're contributing in other ways other than financial, is one way to think about it. On wearing the executive director hat, when I worked at Operation Understanding DC, we really were focused on trying to get alums on our board. And a lot of them, of course, could not afford the mandatory give. And so we had alum board member slots so that they could participate. And we did actually require that they helped with alumni recruitment and things like that. So those are a couple of options that you can think about. as well. And I think we'll just have to keep working on this piece, because the financial piece is a huge barrier. I will say one other thing that I think is really important is that sometimes when we're involved with an organization or a specific body of work, we're so involved in it, we know it so well that we think others do. And so part of it, I think, is a branding communications thing too, that we really want to be able to get the message out to the target audiences that we're looking for, that we want them to be a part of our community. I think sometimes we either have a circle of people that we connect with, or we don't do the proactive work of actually going out and marketing and promoting and telling people who we are and what our organization is and the mission of it. And so that's a part of kind of switching that, that hat a little bit and going externally, as opposed to necessarily people coming in and engaging in that way, I think would be really powerful.
Thanks, Yolanda. Thanks for that question, Roxanne. And thanks, Jamie. Jamie, do you want to share, take yourself off mute and share?
Sure. I was just responding to Roxanne, really, that what I've been thinking about is creating a sustaining amount, which would be a number that I would multiply by the number of board members I have, and then go to the board and say, we need to raise $1 million from this body, and that's what we need together. And some people will give more and some people will give less, but nobody will feel like they're carrying the whole weight, and nobody will feel like they're scholarshiped in. And that way it's, I find that it's one step toward being more equitable. It's not the whole picture, but it's just a piece I'm thinking about in terms of what Roxanne was asking about.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jamie.
I like that.
Annie, we had about 7 minutes left. Any final questions or additional questions for Yolanda?
May I ask a question, Seth?
Please.
Yolanda, first I want to say, I thought that it was self-evident, and I didn't say this earlier. The main reason that I'm here this morning is you. But I want to make sure that's really clear. We haven't met before, and I actually rearranged my schedule to be here this morning because I was so excited to be part of this conversation and hear your thoughts on these issues. Here's my question. I work in my consulting practice with many smaller organizations, but also with larger organizations, and both within the Jewish community and in the broader community. And one of the things about boards that I've noticed, also being on them, is that they tend to be fairly closed systems. Often because in smaller organizations, they were established because when you're getting started, you know, who are you going to ask? You're going to ask your friends, you're going to ask your family, the people who love you. And sometimes for longer established, bigger institutions, you know, there are traditions of who comes onto the board and how. And so what I observe is a lot of boards who are actually very, very serious about equity, and yet have difficulty breaking out of this kind of closed system of networks and relationships, as well as giving clear direction to the staff that this is something that must happen, and that throughout the organization, concrete steps must be taken to support this. And so the movement is slow and sometimes agonizing. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Do you read the situation similarly, differently? And what do you think are some effective first steps for boards that really do want to take steps to become more equitable, not just within the board, but throughout the organization, but also have always, or for a long time, been operating within this kind of closed system of social relationships?
I think it's a phenomenal question, Rebecca, and it's so interesting. I see this all the time. I think it's really easy to say, oh, we are doing DEI work. That's what we do. And then when it boils down to really making the necessary changes, particularly around policies and procedures, because that's where you will find a lot of the things that are inequitable embedded into those. It's not that it's overt that, I'm saying I want to keep, a group of people out of the board or those kinds of things, but there are things that are so nuanced, but very, very effective in making sure that the board, the organization looks the same way it looked 50 years ago. I'm exaggerating, but my point is that I've found that people don't necessarily make the connection to the DEI work and changing policies and procedures to make sure that they're making things open and available and accessible to people who were who were not a part of the system before, because the system has been designed with very few people in mind. And in order to really expand that and make sure that it's accessible for everyone, those changes have to be made. And that's hard because people are used to doing things the way they've always done them and don't necessarily see the connections through inhibiting true DEI work and inclusion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yolanda. So we actually would like to end by asking you if you would offer a question to everyone else to consider
Yes.
as a way of wrapping.
I love that, and I always have one. So just thinking about the work ahead of us, this is almost like a little bit of a challenge and a call to action. So just recently, I was reading a book by Octavia Butler, who was a science fiction writer, Black woman, and writes amazing books. And I honestly, transparency, had not read her books before, because I'm not really a sci-fi person and I just hadn't gone into that genre, but it was my turn to select a book. I selected it. And this book, Kindred, actually is a sci-fi book that goes back in time. It was just so interesting that the character kept going back into slavery to try to change what was going to happen in the future. And so I've been thinking a lot about the concept of time, the past, the present, and the future. And one of the things that has really struck me is that the past is something that we can't change. We can learn from the past. We can really understand the past in a more intimate way to transform the future, that we don't want to get stuck in right now and doing a lot of things that aren't going to actually move the needle for people in the future. And so really challenging you to think about the things that you're doing now and how those things are going to actually impact and make a difference tomorrow. And so I would just ask you to really think about that, think about your role in doing that, and being the leaders that you are. How do you use your platform to actually inspire others and model the way for others?
Thank you so much, Yolanda. It's just a pleasure, and hopefully, I know everyone has been able to get at least something from you today. So Seth is going to close us out.
Thank you so much, Yolanda and Gamal. I know it's 10 o'clock, so thank you again for everyone for being here. Again, Yolanda, thanks for carving out the time and space to learn with us. And this is just, this is a process. This is a long haul. It's one step at a time. And we look forward to being in conversation and communication and community with all of you in whatever ways we can be helpful. Gamal and I are going to take a little summer break, and we encourage you all to take a little summer break, and we'll be back in the fall with some new ideas that we're going to be cooking up. And we're going to be around for the next 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes. So if anyone can stick around or has more questions or wants to chat, feel free. And those who need to hop off, of course, thank you and enjoy your weekend and summer. And I'm going to end the recording right now.